The cathedral was silent as Claire Whitmore lifted the wedding ring toward Julian Pierce's perfect waiting hand. Then the doors slammed open. A soaked man in a worn gray suit ran down the aisle, breathless eyes locked on her. "Don't marry him, he's using you." Gasps swept the pews. Julian's face went white for half a second, then hardened into outrage. He pointed at the stranger, accusing him of extortion. But when Caleb Monroe placed a single black USB drive on the altar, Claire's hand began to tremble. 2 hours before the doors slammed open, Claire Whitmore stood in a private side room of the cathedral, watching Boston rain streak the leaded glass windows. The dress was ivory silk, simple, not the kind a woman wore for a photograph. Her assistant adjusted the veil twice, then stopped trying. Claire was not nervous in the way brides were supposed to be nervous. She was something quieter than that. A woman who had spent 20 years building Whitmore Capital from a leased office in Cambridge into a firm that moved markets, and now at 41 was preparing to share her name with another human being for the first time. Julian Pierce had not asked her for anything. That was what she kept returning to. In the 18 months they had known each other, he had never asked about her holdings, never inquired about the structure of her trusts, never made the small, tired jokes other men made about prenuptial agreements. He listened when she talked about the firm. He listened more carefully when she did not. He had a way of being still in a room that made stillness feel like a gift instead of an absence in that. More than anything else was the reason her hand was steady when she lowered it into his earlier that morning at the rehearsal. The cathedral itself was a quiet kind of grand. Stone arches, dark wood pews, a long aisle lit by candles in iron stands, because Julian had said he preferred candlelight to electric chandeliers. 300 guests filled the rows in tailored black and pale gray, the kind of crowd that did not need name cards to recognize one another. Senators, 2 former cabinet members, a row of partners from the firms that handled her largest accounts. Reporters had been kept outside, but their cameras were waiting on the cathedral steps, and Claire had stopped pretending she did not notice them. Outside those steps on the far side of the rain, a man named Caleb Monroe stood in a worn gray suit that did not fit the way a wedding suit was supposed to fit. He had bought it second-hand the day before. The USB drive was in his right pocket, wrapped in a folded piece of paper, because his hands had been shaking when he left the apartment, and he had not trusted the shaking to stop. He had not slept. He had read the wedding announcement 3 weeks earlier in a magazine someone had left on a clinic counter, and from that moment forward, there had been only one decision left to make. He watched the cathedral doors from across the street. He told himself he could still leave. He told himself a man with no money and no lawyer and a face nobody knew wasn't going to walk into a room full of senators and be heard. He told himself this for almost an hour. Then the rain got harder, and he crossed the street anyway, because the alternative was sitting in a parked car somewhere, knowing what he had let happen. Inside the ceremony began the way these ceremonies always began. The priest spoke about covenant. Julian's vows were short and clean, written by someone who understood that the woman across from him distrusted excess. Claire's vows were shorter. She had written them in a notebook the previous week and had not let anyone read them, not even her assistant. When she said them out loud, she did not look at the guests. She looked only at Julian, and Julian looked back at her with the same patient, attentive expression he had worn since the first dinner. The priest reached the part about the rings. Claire turned to the small wooden tray beside the altar and lifted the band. It was platinum unengraved. She had ordered it without telling Julian, and he had pretended to be surprised when she showed it to him, though she had known by then that he was a man who pretended very well about small things, and she had decided to find that endearing. She raised it toward his hand. His fingers opened to receive it. The cathedral doors opened first. The sound was not dramatic, only the heavy click of a latch giving way, and then footsteps on stone. Heads turned in the back rows before they turned in the front. Caleb walked the length of the aisle in a soaked suit, water still dripping from his cuffs onto the marble. He did not run. He did not need to. Nobody in the cathedral moved fast enough to stop him. He stopped 6 feet from the altar. His voice was rough, used up before it began. "Don't marry him. He's using you. He's done it before." The silence that followed was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of 300 people simultaneously calculating how to stand up without being the first to stand up. Claire did not move. The ring was still raised between her fingers, halfway to Julian's hand. Julian recovered first. He recovered, as though the recovery had been rehearsed. His shoulders lowered, his face shifted into something between weariness and pity, and he turned toward the priest with a small, apologetic shake of the head. "I am so sorry. I did not think he would actually come." He looked at Claire then, and his voice softened. "I should have told you. He approached me last year asking for money. A lot of money. When I refused, he started sending letters. My lawyers told me to ignore him. I thought he had moved on. 2 of Claire's security staff had already begun walking up the side aisles. One of her cousins, who handled press for the firm, was on his feet with his phone already out. The cathedral was about to absorb the moment the way it absorbed every other moment, by smoothing it, by removing the body, by continuing. Claire watched her fiancé's face. He was good. He was very good. The pity in his expression was calibrated to the exact degree that a falsely accused man would feel, pity no more and no less, and that was the first thing that struck her as wrong. A man who had been ambushed at his own wedding by a stranger should have been further from composure than this. The security staff reached Caleb and took him by the elbows. He did not resist. He kept his eyes on Claire instead, and he spoke once more before they could turn him toward the door. "He told my wife the exact same words he is telling you." Claire heard him clearly because the cathedral was built for voices to carry. She watched Julian when the words landed. It was less than a second. A flicker in the eye, a tightening at the corner of the mouth, the smallest possible recalibration of someone who had just heard a sentence he had been trained to expect from a different person in some other room at some other time. Then it was gone, and the patient pity was back, and Julian was already turning to the priest to apologize again on Caleb's behalf. But Claire had seen it. She had built a career on seeing things in faces that other people missed. Caleb pulled one arm free for a moment, just long enough to reach into his pocket. He set the USB drive on the corner of the altar beside the ring tray. The plastic shell was wet. He did not say anything else for several seconds. Then he looked at Claire and said one more thing quietly, almost gently, as if he was sorry to be the person delivering it. Her name was Lillian Monroe. "Look it up before you put that ring on his hand." Security pulled him back. He let them. He had already done what he came to do. Claire's hand was still in the air. She had not moved since Caleb spoke the first sentence. The ring caught the candlelight and threw a small, bright reflection across the white altar cloth. She lowered it. She did not lower it dramatically. She lowered it the way she signed contracts, the way she ended phone calls, the way she did every important thing in her life, which was with the smallest possible motion and the most complete possible decision. She set the ring back into its small velvet box on the tray. She closed the box. Then she turned to face the cathedral. "I'm asking everyone to leave," she said. Her voice was clear enough to reach the back row. "The ceremony is paused. I'll make a statement to the press tomorrow. I'd like the cathedral cleared in the next 10 minutes. The murmuring began at once. Julian stepped toward her, his hand reaching for her arm. "Claire." "Not now." She did not look at him when she said it. She was already looking at the USB drive on the altar, and at the small, dark stain its wet plastic was leaving on the linen. The cathedral emptied in 12 minutes. Claire's security walked the guests out through the side entrance to keep them away from the cameras still waiting on the front steps. Julian didn't leave. He stood near the altar with his hands folded in front of him, holding a posture meant to look like patient concern for a wife in distress. Claire did not go home. She walked through a stone corridor into the small private conference room the cathedral kept for family meetings before funerals. Her assistant brought Nolan Mercer in through a side door 6 minutes later. He had been waiting in a car 2 blocks away since the rehearsal the previous night, because Claire kept her personal attorney close at every public event, and because Nolan had learned in 14 years of working for her that proximity was the entire job. He was a thin man with a quiet face. He did not ask what had happened. He had heard from the driver on the way in. He set his briefcase on the long oak table and waited for her to speak first. "I want the drive opened. I want it opened now, in this room, with no copies leaving until I tell you they can leave." Nolan nodded once. He took the USB from her and connected it to the encrypted laptop he carried for client work. The wet plastic had dried in her palm during the walk over, but the drive booted on the first try. Julian appeared in the doorway before the file directory finished loading. He had taken off his boutonniere. His voice was low and warm, the voice of someone who had decided that gentleness would serve him better than alarm. "Claire, whatever is on that drive, he made it. He's had a year to make it. Don't let a stranger turn this into something it isn't." Claire did not turn around. She kept her eyes on the laptop screen. "Nolan, please ask him to wait outside." Julian did not move. He spoke to her back instead, and the warmth in his voice thinned by exactly the amount it needed to thin. "If you keep going down this road, the firm is going to feel it by Monday. Your board meets on Tuesday. You have a press window of about 30 hours before this becomes a story you cannot take back." Nolan stepped between Julian and the table without raising his voice. "Mr. Pierce, you are welcome to wait in the corridor or to leave the building. You are not welcome in this conversation." Julian held his ground for another 3 seconds. Then he gave Claire a small, wounded look, the look of a husband who had been wronged, but was choosing to be merciful, and he stepped back into the corridor. The door closed behind him. Claire pulled out a chair and sat down. Nolan turned the laptop toward her. The drive contained 6 folders, labeled with dates, the earliest going back to 2017. Inside the folders were emails, scanned, letters, recorded, phone calls, photographs of bank statements, and a single text document at the top level called "Read First." She opened "Read First." It was 4 pages long, written in plain, unformatted type, the kind of document produced by someone who had rehearsed the sentences in his head so many times that flourishes had fallen off them. It was Caleb Monroe's account of how his wife Lillian had met a man named Julian Pierce in the spring of 2017 at a charity benefit in Providence, and how over the next 18 months, that man had taken everything from her. Claire read the document once without speaking. She read it a second time. Then she opened the folders. The earliest emails were exactly what she had expected to feel sick reading. Julian had written to Lillian the same kind of letters he had written to Claire in the first months of their relationship. The phrasings were not similar. They were identical. Sentences about how he had spent his life around impressive people, but had never met someone who carried so much weight so quietly. Sentences about how he understood that she did not need to be rescued, only met. The lines were almost word for word, the lines he had used on Claire on a terrace in the South End in early 2024. And Claire remembered standing on that terrace and thinking that no man had ever spoken to her that way before. Nolan watched her face. He did not say anything. He had been a lawyer long enough to know that silence was the only respectful response to certain kinds of recognition. She moved through the audio files next. There were 7 of them. 2 were voicemails Julian had left for Lillian over the course of one weekend in 2018, when Lillian's family business had been on the verge of insolvency. In the recordings, Julian was steady, soothing, full of a quiet confidence that the worst was almost over and that she only needed to sign one more document to get the bridge financing into her account. Claire recognized the cadence. He had used the same cadence on her at a dinner 6 months ago when she had been hesitating over a contract she did not need to sign. The bank statements told the rest. Lillian Monroe had transferred just under $1.4 million to 2 different shell accounts over the course of 14 months. The accounts were in Delaware registered to consulting firms that had no employees and no clients. The money had moved through 3 more entities before disappearing into something Nolan would need a forensic team to trace. By the time Lillian had understood what was happening, her family business had been pledged as collateral on personal guarantees she did not remember signing. Caleb had tried to stop her in the last 6 months. The drive contained a hospital admission record from late 2019 that Claire did not finish reading. She closed the laptop. Nolan spoke for the first time in almost an hour. I want to be careful about what I say next, because I have not verified any of this independently. But the structural pattern in those documents is consistent. Whoever set up those entities knew what they were doing, and they did it more than once. Claire looked at him. More than once, meaning what? Meaning the legal architecture in Lillian Monroe's case is not bespoke. It is templated. People only template things they intend to reuse. She sat with that for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was level. I want you to find out how many other women there are. I want the names, the timelines, and the dollar amounts. I want it before the board meets on Tuesday. And I want Caleb Monroe brought back into this building. He has been sitting in a side room with my security for the last hour. I want him here. Nolan was already standing. I will need a small team, 3 people, all under my direct supervision. Nobody at the firm hears anything until you say so. Do it. He left. Claire sat alone in the conference room for several minutes. She did not cry. She had not cried at her father's funeral, and she did not cry now. She thought instead about the terrace in the South End, and about the exact phrasing Julian had used about wait, and about how she had let that phrasing settle into her like a thing she had been waiting her whole life to hear. Then she stood up and went to find her fiancé. He was in the corridor exactly where he had said he would be, leaning against the stone wall, with his hands in his pockets. When he saw her, his face did the soft, relieved thing it always did. He took a step toward her. Claire, thank you for coming back. I know what this looks like. I know what he wants you to think. She stopped before he could close the distance. I read the drive. He did not flinch. He had prepared for this too. Then you read whatever he wanted you to read. You read his version, written by him, edited by him, presented by him, on a device he handed you in the middle of our wedding. That is not evidence. That is theater. His voice softened by another degree. I've been quiet about this because I did not want to drag you into something ugly. But I will tell you now. He has been writing to my office for almost 2 years. He sent 14 letters in the first 6 months. He wanted money. When I stopped responding, he started sending things to my family. My mother changed her phone number twice. He took another small step. Claire, look at him. Look at what he is. A widower with no income, no career, no standing, who appears in a soaked suit at a wedding 300 people are watching with a conveniently produced thumb drive. Ask yourself, who benefits from this story? It is not me. It was a good answer. It was, she realized, an excellent answer. If she had not seen the flicker in his eye at the altar an hour and a half earlier, she might have believed him for at least another 20 minutes. She did not believe him, but she did not say so. She let her face do something close to uncertainty, because Nolan had not finished his work yet, and because she had learned a long time ago that a woman with information was only powerful if the man across from her did not yet know she had it. I need time, Julian. He nodded gravely. Take whatever you need. But please, do not let a stranger and something we both know is real. She walked past him without answering. Nolan worked through the night and into the next morning. He set up 2 encrypted laptops in a suite at the hotel Claire was staying in 3 blocks from the cathedral. He brought in a forensic accountant he had used twice before on internal investigations at the firm. By 6 in the morning, they had cross-matched the Delaware shell entities against 4 other women in 3 different states, going back almost a decade. The pattern was the same in every case. Wealthy, unmarried, or recently widowed, between 38 and 54, no close family on the financial side. Julian had appeared at a charity event, a board fundraiser, an art opening. He had taken 8 to 14 months to move from introduction to engagement. In 2 cases, he had married. In both of those cases, the marriages had ended within 3 years, with the women significantly poorer and unwilling to speak publicly about why. Claire read the summary at 7 in the morning, sitting on the edge of the hotel bed, in the same ivory dress she had not changed out of. Nolan had brought coffee. She did not drink it. There are at least 4. There are probably more we have not found yet. Nolan nodded. He's not a man who fell in love and made bad choices. He's a closed business model. She set the summary down. Bring Caleb up. Caleb arrived 10 minutes later. He had not slept either. The borrowed suit had been replaced by a sweatshirt and jeans her security had loaned him from a duffel bag in the trunk of the car. He stood inside the door of the suite, as if he was not sure he was allowed to sit down. Claire told him to sit. She told him she had read the document and the files and the bank records. She told him she believed him. He did not say anything for a long time. When he did, his voice was thin and careful, the voice of a man who had been called a liar for so many years that being believed felt structurally unsafe. I'm not asking for anything. I want you to know that. I know, she said. That is partly how I knew you were telling the truth. The first message from Julian came an hour later, delivered by a courier to the hotel's front desk. It was a sealed envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a USB drive of his own. The sheet of paper was a draft of a civil complaint prepared by a firm in New York that Claire recognized alleging breach of a written premarital agreement, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The damages requested were $60 million. The USB drive was labeled in Julian's handwriting. The label said simply, "For your consideration." Nolan plugged it into a clean laptop in a separate room. Claire watched from the doorway. The drive contained 2 folders. The first folder held copies of private correspondence between her and Julian over the previous 18 months, including emails she had written from her firm account photographs from a weekend they had spent in Maine, and audio of a phone call she did not remember being recorded. The second folder held internal Whitmore Capital documents. Memoranda, 2 unfinished acquisition models, a draft of a board presentation on a sensitive divestment that had not yet been announced. Nolan looked at her without speaking. He did not need to explain what the second folder meant. Julian had not just been planning to marry her. He had been preparing, in case the marriage fell through, to use the 18 months of access to extract enough material to make her choose between paying him and watching her firm bleed in the press for 6 months. He had built 2 doors, one marked husband, one marked extortionist. He had been ready to walk through whichever one she left open. Claire sat down on the arm of the suite's couch. She did not feel angry yet. She would feel angry later, in a way that would be useful. What she felt now in the quiet of the hotel room was something simpler and more difficult to name. She had spent her entire adult life building a self that nobody could reach, and she had handed the keys to that self willingly to a man who had been counting them the whole time. Nolan was waiting for her instructions. She looked at the screen, then at the draft complaint on the table, then at Caleb, who had not moved from the chair by the window. She thought about Lillian Monroe, whom she had never met, and about how Julian had probably sat in a hotel room very much like this one several years ago, planning the same 2 doors for her. "Get the board on the phone," she said. "Tell them I am calling an emergency session for tomorrow morning, and get me a meeting with Julian. Today, before he files anything." The meeting was set for 4 in the afternoon, back inside the cathedral, in the same private conference room where Claire had first opened the drive. She chose the location deliberately. She wanted Julian to walk through the same corridor he had used to follow her the night before, to sit at the same oak table where he had asked her to take all the time she needed. She wanted the room to remember what he had said in it. Nolan arrived first. He set up 2 recording devices on the table, both visible. He did not hide them. The forensic accountant sat in a smaller chair against the wall with a closed binder on his lap. Caleb sat in the chair by the window where he had been the night before, his hands folded between his knees. Claire had asked him to come. He had not asked why. Julian arrived 2 minutes late in a dark suit, and no tie, dressed to look like someone who had been awake all night, caring about something. He looked at the recording devices. He looked at Caleb. He smiled, small and tired, and sat down across from Claire without being asked. "This is a lot of audience for a private conversation." Claire did not return the smile. "There is no private conversation anymore. I asked you here so that you could say what you have to say once on the record, and then leave." He let his hands rest on the table. "Then I will say it once. I love you. Whatever has been put in front of you in the last 20 hours, it has been arranged by a man with nothing to lose. He has been writing to me for 2 years. I have the letters. I can produce them. You have built a life on judgment, Claire. Use it now." The voice was perfect. It was the same voice from the terrace in the South End. It was the same voice from the voicemails to Lillian. Claire heard both at once layered, and the layering was almost dizzying for a moment, before it settled into something she could use. She slid the draft complaint across the table toward him. "You sent this to my hotel at 9 this morning." He glanced down at it without picking it up. "I sent that as a precaution. My lawyers insisted. After yesterday, I could not afford not to protect myself." She slid the second item across. It was a printout of the file directory from the USB drive he had sent with the complaint. The internal Whitmore Capital documents were highlighted in yellow. And these? Were these also a precaution? Julian did not answer immediately. The recovery this time took almost a full second, and Claire watched it happen, the same flicker she had seen at the altar, only longer, because the room was smaller, and there was no audience to perform pity for. When he spoke, the voice had shifted. It was still warm, but the warmth had a different temperature. Now the warmth of a man who had stopped pretending he was the one in trouble. "Claire, let's be adults about this. You have a board meeting tomorrow. I have material that is at minimum embarrassing for you and your firm. I am not interested in embarrassing you. I am interested in walking out of this without a public fight. We can sign something this evening. Your reputation stays intact. My career stays intact. The man in the corner gets whatever closure he came here to get. Everybody goes home." Caleb did not move. He had been told before the meeting started that he would not need to speak unless Claire asked him to, and he had agreed without argument. Claire kept her hands flat on the table. "You used the same sentences on me that you used on Lillian Monroe. Word for word. Nolan has them side by side." Julian's face did something that was not quite a smile. "People in love repeat themselves. That is not a crime. You moved $1.4 million out of her family business through Delaware shells you reused on at least 3 other women. That is a crime. You don't know that those entities are mine." Nolan spoke for the first time without looking up from his notepad. "We will know by Thursday. The forensic team is already inside the registration records. We have a cooperating witness in one of the agent firms. You should plan accordingly." Julian looked at Nolan for a long moment. Then he looked back at Claire, and the warmth was gone entirely now. What replaced it was not anger. It was something colder, something almost bored, the expression of a man who had run this scenario in his head before, and had decided in advance how to behave if it ever became real. "You will not do this publicly," he said. "You don't have the stomach. Women like you would rather lose $100 million in private than admit on a stage that they were fooled. That is the entire reason you were a target. You build empires on never being wrong. The day you stand up in front of your board and say, 'I picked the wrong man,' you stop being who you have spent 20 years becoming." He turned his head toward Caleb without softening his face. "And you, the grieving widower in the borrowed suit, selling his dead wife's tragedy to whichever rich woman will listen. You think you came here to save someone. You came here because you have nothing else, and a broken man with nothing else is the easiest kind of man to point at a target." Caleb's jaw tightened. He started to stand. Claire raised one hand just slightly without looking at him. He sat back down. She let the room be quiet for a moment. Not for effect, because she wanted to be sure of her voice before she used it. "You are right that I have built my life on not being wrong," she said. "And you are right that admitting this in public will cost me something I have spent 20 years protecting. I want you to understand that I have already decided to pay that cost. I decided last night. The only reason I asked you here today was to see whether you would give me a reason not to. You have not." She nodded toward Nolan. He opened the binder beside him. "At 9 tomorrow morning, my board will receive a complete file. The shell entity records the cross-matched victims, the audio comparisons, the bank trail in the Lillian Monroe case, and a copy of the documents you sent me this morning, which established that you were in possession of confidential firm material before our wedding date, and used that material to threaten me. At 10, that file will be in the hands of the United States Attorney's Office in Boston. At 11, my communications team will release a statement under my name, Force." Julian's hands did not move on the table, but his fingers had gone very still, in a way that fingers go still when a man is calculating exits. "I will not sign your settlement," Claire said. "I will not negotiate. I will not pay you to leave. You should understand that any complaint you file against me will be answered with the full file I just described, and that the firm Nolan retained on my behalf at 6 this morning is one of the 4 firms in this country I would not want to be sued by. You will lose. You will lose publicly, and every woman after Lillian, whose name we have not yet found, will read about it in the paper, and know that she was not the only one." She stood up. So did Nolan. Caleb stood last, slowly, as if he wasn't sure he was allowed to. Julian remained seated for another moment. Then he stood as well. He did not say anything else. He walked to the door, opened it, and left without closing it behind him. Claire watched the empty doorway for a few seconds. Then she turned to Caleb. "Thank you for walking into a room nobody wanted you in." He looked at the floor. "I didn't think you would listen." "I almost didn't." The board meeting happened the next morning as planned. The file went to the prosecutors at 10. The statement went out at 11, under Claire's name, 4 paragraphs long, with no apology and no melodrama. It said that she had ended her engagement after discovering that the man she had agreed to marry had a documented history of financial exploitation of women, that the relevant evidence had been turned over to federal authorities, and that she would have nothing further to say while the investigation was active. The cathedral was emptied of flowers by Wednesday. The platinum band was returned to the jeweler. Claire did not keep it, and she did not save the velvet box. 3 months later, the Whitmore Foundation announced a new initiative aimed at survivors of long-term financial and emotional manipulation, with intake services, legal aid, and direct grants for women whose assets had been moved out of their reach. The foundation did not name the initiative after Claire. It named it the Lillian Monroe Project. Caleb was listed as a founding advisor. He did not attend the press conference. He sent a short written statement that thanked Claire for using her name, where his could not be heard, and asked that no further attention be paid to him. Manipulation does not always arrive shouting. Sometimes it walks in well-dressed, speaks softly, and remembers the weight you carry. The truth, when it finally comes, does not always wear a tie. Sometimes it walks in soaked to the skin in a borrowed suit in front of 300 people who would rather it had stayed outside, and asks only to be heard once before the door closes again.